you create a new table or feature class in the Geodatabase, the ArcGIS platform adds some system reserved fields to this table or feature class. ObjectID is one of them, right? And in this episode, we're going to discuss the usefulness of these and how you code against those classes and system reserved field coming up. Hey guys, it's Hussein. Before we jump to the podcast, I just want to share with you some exciting news. I just published my new Kindle book on November 18th titled Learn GIS Programming with ArcGIS Online and the JavaScript API 4.9. That's the latest and greatest, shiniest stuff. Been working on this book for 6 months and I'm so excited that it's finally done and it's there. This book is designed for entry-level developers who are interested in building web applications on top of the ArcGIS Online with the JavaScript API. You don't have to have programming knowledge, or you just have to have like very basic programming knowledge. This book is written for Linux, Windows, and Mac users. Check it out. It will mean the world to me. Thank you very much. Check it out. www.husseinnasser.com. I'm going to put it in the description in the podcast. And with that said, let's get on with the show. What's up, y'all? This is your host Hussein Nasser from iGeometry, where we discuss software engineering by example. Welcome to another Geodatabase talk. Let's talk about the ObjectID field and really other system reserved fields in the Geodatabase. Obviously, when you create a new table, the ArcGIS platform has to have a way to identify every single row with a unique identifier. Okay, this was always been using the ObjectID and more recently using the global ID, which is a unique identifier across the entire global Geodatabase instead of just that table. And this started to be a very critical requirement, and not only for sync, for example, but replication and other branch versioning, for example, many other new system functionality. So I wanted to talk about just the system reserved fields in general. And every time we think about this concept, adding a new system reserved field to a feature class or a table, you have to think that this field we cannot really hard code that field to be always named global ID or object ID, because you can have a normal database table with your own field that happens to be called ObjectID, correct? So now if you enable that, if you copy that class into a Geodatabase, the ArcGIS will obviously try to add ObjectID field and says, hey, looks like the user already have this field that is called ObjectID. We're not gonna touch that, right? So we're gonna create a new ObjectID field, and it's happened to be ObjectID _1 maybe, or _1 or 2, whatever the name is. Internally, the Geodatabase understand that for this particular table, the ObjectID field is not necessarily called ObjectID. It could be called ObjectID_1. So that Geodatabase keeps track of this, right? And you, as a developer, writing applications, we've all made this mistake. When I was a developer back, and then my utility back in Bahrain, I was doing this mistake as well. I was always assuming that the ObjectID field always should be called ObjectID, or the global ID should always be called the global ID, and you're gonna hard code your application on that assumption. The problem with that is, if you're coding your application to be generic, if you're building a product, then this product might not work on any geodatabase. You want your product to work, to connect to a geodatabase and magically identify tables and work with those object tables. And to do that, you have to take these metadata really seriously. And even the editor tracking, right, fields, they could be created as or created by, or right, but these fields could have been reserved by the user. So you have to create new. You have to always code against the abstraction of these fields, right? You ask the Geodatabase, and there are API for ArcObject, and there are API for the feature service as well. And that API will tell you that, hey, the ObjectID field for this particular table is called blah, right? Whatever. And that you then go and ask that question accordingly, right? Because again, you can have a table, your own table, database, normal table, it's not even a geodatabase, and then it has happened to have an ObjectID field, and then you copy this table into a geodatabase that adds the ObjectID_1, for example, and that becomes your ObjectID, and then you go ahead and delete your ObjectID field. And then this application that you have written to assume that the ObjectID field is always called ObjectID will not work, because you're hard coding against that system reserved field. Does that make sense, guys? Hope that makes sense. I just want to talk about that, because it's a really, this model is pretty cool if you think about it, because it gives you this another way of looking into programming and design and engineering, to engineer your application or your system. Forget about the geodatabase, just in your future projects, especially if you have higher extensions or applications that code against your API, you want to make this as flexible as possible. You can't make, I guess you can if you want to, but this will result into a very rigid system, right? Imagine if you have an ObjectID field and you try to copy it into a geodatabase and says, hey, can't copy because you have a field called ObjectID and we really need that. That will be bad, right? You want me to get rid of my data just because I want you to create a geodatabase? No, not really, right? So think about how to extend your system in a way that is actually essentially to be extended very easily without forcing users to change their data model. That makes sense, guys? I think that's what I wanted to discuss in this episode. So if you are writing applications today, avoid hard coding the global ID or object ID or anything that is you think that it's always gonna be the same, right? Because it's not. All right, guys. There are certain fields that are invisible, or certain tables that are invisible to the outside world, to the users, and that's definitely hard-coded. If you look at the database, you'll find tables like GDB items, and obviously these must be called whatever they are called, right? You cannot, because they are system-maintained tables. They don't belong to the user, they belong to the schema of the Geodatabase, right? And that's, yes, those are obviously hard-coded, essentially. But if it's a table that belongs, the user actually owns the table, if you think about it. So anything ArcGIS system adds, pads essentially, to the end of the table, will still, the table still belongs to the user. So ArcGIS system tries to, as much as possible, make this flexible enough so we can always succeed in enabling the Geodatabase without any problems. All right, guys, hope you're having a great week. Thanksgiving is upon us. Happy Thanksgiving, guys. And I'm gonna see you in the next one. You guys stay awesome.
The podcast you just heard was made using Anchor. Ever thought about making your own podcast? Anchor makes it really easy for anyone to get started. It's a one-stop shop for recording, hosting, and distributing podcasts. Best of all, it's 100% free. Sign up now at anchor.fm/new. That's anchor.fm/new to get started.